The Russia story is a total fabrication. It's just an excuse for the greatest loss in the history of American politics. Democrat lawmakers will have to decide. They can continue their obsession with the Russian hoax, or they can serve the interests of the American people.
The president moments ago calling the Russia investigation led by special counsel Robert Mueller a hoax. There are now two bipartisan efforts to protect the special counsel from any action by President Trump or his subordinates to fire him. A new Senate bill co-sponsored by Republican Senator Thom Tillis of North Carolina, Democratic Senator Chris Coons of Delaware, which would be retroactive to Mueller's appointment, would give a special counsel the ability to challenge in court their termination. A three-judge panel would be impaneled to determine good cause for the firing. Otherwise, the special counsel would be reinstated. The bill's co-sponsor, Senator Tillis, stressed the need for true independence in all the key Justice Department positions.
So this is an opportunity to show to the American people we're serious about independence, we're serious about being held to a high standard, and the Department of Justice is unique among cabinet positions because, on the one hand, the president nominates the FBI director or the AG, but just after they're confirmed, I want them to be very independent.
This arrives just a week after another bipartisan effort to protect the independence of the special counsel, one co-sponsored by Senators Lindsey Graham and Cory Booker, that would block the president from firing the special counsel without a judge's approval when that special counsel is investigating the president, as is now the case. Congressman Adam Schiff of House Intel Committee tweeting, "If true that Mueller has impaneled a grand jury suggests his work is proceeding, all the more important that Congress protect his independence." Joining me now, Senator Richard Blumenthal of Connecticut, a member of the Senate Judiciary Committee. How concerned are you about the president attempting to fire Robert Mueller as the investigation takes off?
I'm very deeply concerned because the ominous threats that the president has made about firing Jeff Sessions as a means to fire Bob Mueller, and his direct threats about Mueller, calling the investigation a hoax and a witch hunt, attacking the integrity and credibility of the team, an excellent team of 16 prosecutors that Bob Mueller has assembled. And that's why I have joined with Lindsey Graham as a co-sponsor of that measure that would provide judicial review and stop that firing if it is done without good cause. And I am also heartened by the impanelment of a grand jury because remember, Chris, that a grand jury is an arm of the court. It's not just a tool of the prosecutor. It actually has a legal status under the court's authority. And so a threat against Bob Mueller is less weighty because the grand jury has a degree of permanency and protection that Bob Mueller alone might not have. But this legislation is very important also because it indicates the level of outrage and opposition that would follow any attempt by Donald Trump to fire Bob Mueller. Something significant happened today. Senate went into a 5-week recess, if I'm not mistaken, but Senator Lisa Murkowski locked in what is essentially what is called a pro forma session, which is to essentially make sure that there is for constitutional purposes, not a recess that the president could recess appoint someone, meaning that were the president to say fire Jeff Sessions, he wouldn't be able to put a recess appointment in. How significant and important is that step? What's really significant is not only that step, but I think the very strong determination that there be no recess appointment in the Attorney General position. And I think, again, the firestorm and potential constitutional crisis that would greet this step by Donald Trump is reflected in that step by Lisa Murkowski, senator from Alaska. So I think it's important, but what's even more important is the sense, it's a clear sense, and it is tangible, that there is going to be strong opposition, both sides of the aisle, to this kind of abusive use of power. And obviously, to go back to your first question, the threat is even more ominous because clearly the special counsel is following the money. He's going after financial dealings. Those financial dealings are extremely relevant because the Russian playbook is to enlist or engage foreign officials and create monetary incentives for them to cooperate. That is exactly what may have happened here. Bob Mueller knows it. He's going to follow the money.
Yeah, there is reporting about those money trails, and there's also been some significant pushback from the White House on that. The president, in an interview with the New York Times, saying that pursuit of financial deals prior to his campaign would be out of bounds. It would violate essentially the portfolio of the special counsel. Jay Sekulow sort of repeating that same notion that he would object, and the lawyers for the president would object to following the trail of, say, real estate deals that happened 6 or 7 years ago. What's your response to that?
They have no legal power and no moral case to try to constrain a grand jury. The grand jury has an authority that is part of the rule of law. And by the way, as a prosecutor, as the United States Attorney for Connecticut for 4.5 years, I've seen grand juries often develop their own questions and want to know about financial transactions. They are composed of ordinary citizens who often have very good questions. And the other reason I think this grand jury is going to be important to the special counsel is that we are dealing here with a potential indictment of the highest ranking official in the United States of America. So Bob Mueller is going to want to know how the average citizen reacts to this evidence. It's going to be a very good sign for him of what a jury, a regular jury at trial, might react to. We're a bit ahead of ourselves. There's no conclusive proof of any crime here. But very importantly, that grand jury can ask its own questions. So for the president or any part of his staff to say they're going to draw lines is completely inappropriate.
Succinctly, I want you just to clarify, when you say we're dealing with the potential of an indictment of the highest ranking official in the U.S., you mean you believe it is a possibility that for an indictment of the President of the United States?
It is certainly a possibility. There's a lot of authority that there cannot be an indictment of the president. When I say authority, there's no real legal case law,
right,
but there are pretty good legal arguments against it. Still, if he is out of office, there could be an indictment, and there could be indictments of lower level officials and members of his family.
All right, Senator Richard Blumenthal, thank you.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.